For 20 years, Gray Sloan Memorial Hospital has felt like a real place. Real enough that when a character disappeared, it didn't feel like a casting decision. It felt like losing someone. But almost none of those exits happened the way the show presented them. Behind nearly every dramatic goodbye on Grey's Anatomy sits a much messier, much more human story. Contract fights, burnout, addiction, a slur that ended a career, and at least one ultimatum that decided whether a show's biggest star would survive a single more season. This is what actually happened to the cast of the longest-running primetime medical drama in American television history. Grey's Anatomy premiered in March 2005 after Shonda Rhimes pitched something deliberately different from the hospital dramas that came before it. She wanted flawed, complicated women at the center, not supporting characters. She wrote her core cast without specifying race or gender, then cast the best actor for each part, which is part of why the show looked nothing like its competitors when it landed in a plum Sunday slot behind Desperate Housewives. The ratings exploded almost immediately, and by season 2 the show was pulling in over 20 million viewers a week. Awards followed. So did a level of pop culture saturation few medical dramas have ever matched. McDreamy and McSteamy became part of the national vocabulary, and My Person became something people said about their best friends without ever having watched a single episode. 20 years and over 400 episodes later, the show is still airing, which means it has also had 2 decades to lose almost its entire founding cast. Of the original surgical interns introduced in episode 1, only Ellen Pompeo's Meredith Grey made it to the show's 20th anniversary as anything more than a guest appearance. Everyone else left, and each exit got packaged for the audience as a tidy plot point, a death, a transfer, a fresh start somewhere new. Almost none of those tidy explanations were the full story. But success on that scale came with a cost, and the people paying it were standing under the studio lights every day, sometimes 15 hours at a stretch, 10 months out of the year, for years on end. Burnout, addiction, contract fights, and old-fashioned office politics shaped this show's history just as much as anything that ever happened in a fictional operating room. Here's what was actually going on behind each of those goodbyes. In October 2006, a heated confrontation broke out between Isaiah Washington and Patrick Dempsey on set. During the argument, Washington used a homophobic slur, and he used it in reference to co-star T.R. Knight, who had not yet come out publicly. Knight later said the entire crew heard it. The fallout was immediate and devastating for Knight personally. Within months he came out in a People magazine interview, on his own terms but on a timeline he didn't choose. Washington apologized at the time, but the situation reignited in January 2007 at the Golden Globes, where Grey's won Best Drama. Asked by reporters about the incident, Washington denied using the slur against Knight at all, and in doing so, repeated the word itself on camera. The denial detonated the story all over again. GLAAD condemned him publicly. ABC issued its own rebuke. Washington apologized a second time, entered counseling, and even filmed a public service announcement about the power of language. None of it saved his job. In June 2007, ABC announced it would not renew his contract, nearly 6 months after the Golden Globes incident, a delay that drew criticism from people who felt the network had dragged its feet. His character, Dr. Preston Burke, was written off the show by abandoning his fiancée, Christina Young, at the altar, a finale twist that doubled as his real-life exit. Washington later disputed parts of the public narrative, insisting in interviews that he felt he'd been made a scapegoat. He returned for a single guest episode in 2014, a reunion that happened largely because Sandra Oh pushed for it, wanting closure for Christina's story before she left the show herself. In 2007, Hagel won an Emmy for playing Izzy Stevens, a shocking upset over her own castmates Sandra Oh and Chandra Wilson. A year later, she did something almost no actor in television history has done. She withdrew her own name from Emmy consideration, telling the press she didn't feel the material she'd been given that season deserved a nomination. It read, fairly or not, as a public insult to the writers' room, and it permanently changed how she was perceived in the industry. Hagel has since said she regrets how she handled the moment, admitting years later that she'd been trying to make a pointed statement about her storylines and ended up creating a controversy she never fully recovered from. The difficult label stuck to her for the rest of her run. In 2009, she became more vocal about the show's brutal hours, at one point describing the schedule in blunt terms during a late-night interview. By 2010, after adopting her first daughter and asking to scale back her workload, she negotiated an early release from her contract, 18 months ahead of schedule. Her character, Izzy, simply vanished from the show with little ceremony. For years afterward, Hagel found herself frozen out of major roles, something she's openly attributed to the difficult reputation that followed her. It took until 2022, when Ellen Pompeo publicly said Hagel had simply been ahead of her time in speaking up about toxic working conditions, for public opinion to start shifting back in her favor. For years, Derek Shepherd was the most protected character on the series. The romantic anchor Shonda Rhimes had built the entire show's emotional center around. She'd resisted splitting Meredith and Derek up in any lasting way for over a decade because, in her words, he was supposed to be the perfect man, the guy audiences at home wanted to marry. But behind the scenes, tension between Dempsey and the production had been quietly escalating for years. According to Lynette Rice's book How to Save a Life, former executive producer James Parriott described Dempsey as having developed an outsized hold over the set, capable of stopping production and creating what Parriott called genuine anxiety among crew members. He went as far as to say some cast members carried real trauma from working alongside him. Multiple sources described friction between Dempsey and Ellen Pompeo, who reportedly grew frustrated carrying a heavier workload while hearing complaints from a co-star with fewer scenes in any given episode. Producer Janine Renshaw recalled gently reminding Dempsey that crew members had often been on set since 6:30 in the morning, and that he'd usually acknowledge the point once it was pointed out to him directly. By season 11, the relationship between Dempsey and Rhimes had deteriorated to the point that Rhimes ultimately gave the network a stark choice: either Dempsey left the show, or she would. Given what Rhimes meant to the franchise, the network's decision wasn't really a decision at all. Producers reportedly explored other ways to write Derek out that didn't involve killing him, but nothing felt true to the character without ending his life. Dempsey's death was filmed in near-total secrecy at an abandoned hospital, with cast members signing non-disclosure agreements to protect the twist, and the episode aired in April 2015 to genuine shock from fans who had no idea the ending was coming. Dempsey himself has been candid that the unrelenting schedule, 10 months a year, often 15-hour days, with so little control over his own calendar that he sometimes couldn't tell his own kids what he'd be doing the next day, had worn him down, and that he likely should have stepped away sooner on his own terms. Years later, he and Pompeo repaired their relationship enough that he returned for a brief, much-loved dream sequence appearance during the show's COVID-era season, something Pompeo has said took a real, deliberate effort from both of them to make happen. Long before fans knew Christina Young was leaving, O had already started therapy specifically to prepare herself for the eventual loss of a role that had defined a decade of her life. In 2012, when contracts for the show's original 6 leads came up for renewal, O quietly began weighing what came next while the rest of the cast negotiated new deals. By the end of that year she'd made her decision. Season 10 would be her last. What followed wasn't a rushed exit. O and Rhimes spent more than a year designing Christina's send-off together, eventually deciding to send the character to Zurich to run a cutting-edge cardiothoracic institute, a storyline that matched the ambition Christina had carried since the pilot. By the time her final episode aired in May 2014, O had appeared in 216 episodes, earned a Golden Globe, and collected 5 Emmy nominations. She said publicly that she felt it was time to let the character go because she sensed Christina herself was ready to move on. It remains one of the cleanest, most amicable exits in the show's history, largely because O treated it less like quitting a job and more like finishing a chapter she'd chosen to close. Dane played plastic surgeon Mark Sloan from 2006 until his character's death in the season 9 premiere, following a plane crash that also killed Lexi Gray. While on the show, Dane checked himself into rehab for an addiction to painkillers, a struggle he didn't speak about publicly in detail until years afterward. In a 2024 interview, he was unusually candid, saying he believed he'd ultimately been let go from the show, even though the official reasoning given was budgetary. By that point in his run, his salary had become one of the more expensive line items on a show juggling a large ensemble cast. Dane has said the network's decision wasn't explicitly because of his struggles with addiction, though he acknowledged it certainly didn't help his case. He later found a second creative life on Euphoria, ironically earning more per episode there than he ever did at Grey's Anatomy. Eric Dane passed away in February 2026 following a battle with ALS, which he had spoken about publicly and turned into an advocacy platform in his final months. Patrick Dempsey, reflecting on his former co-star afterward, said Dane had shown real courage in using his diagnosis to raise awareness, and that it served as a reminder to value every day. Lee played Lexi Gray from 2007 until the character's death in the season 8 finale plane crash, a storyline Rhimes and Lee developed together specifically because they wanted Lexi's exit to leave a real emotional mark on the audience. At the time, Lee said she was stepping away to spend more time with her 3 children. It wasn't until 2019, 7 years after she'd left the show, that Lee spoke publicly for the first time about living with bipolar disorder, a condition she'd actually been diagnosed with in the midst of her run on Grey's Anatomy. She described reaching a breaking point around 2011, including a brief hospitalization, before finding treatment that finally worked for her. Lee has said she kept the diagnosis private for years out of fear of stigma, only choosing to speak up as part of a mental health awareness campaign once she felt ready. Her exit from the show and her health struggles weren't presented as the same story at the time, but knowing both pieces now gives her departure a different, heavier context than fans understood in 2012. Chambers had been part of the cast since the pilot, playing Alex Karev for 16 seasons. In January 2020, with almost no warning, he announced he was leaving, saying simply that after 15 years on one character, he wanted to diversify his career and spend more time with his 5 children. There was no farewell press tour, no big send-off episode. His last on-screen appearance had already aired 2 months earlier, and the show explained his absence through voiceover letters rather than a final scene. Then showrunner Krista Vernoff repeatedly declined to elaborate on the circumstances when asked directly by reporters. In a later interview for How to Save a Life, Chambers offered some insight into his mindset, describing years on a long-running set as feeling like a routine he'd been running on autopilot, the same studio, the same 4 walls, day after day. The show's eventual choice to send Alex back to ex-wife Izzy Stevens, abandoning his on-screen wife Jo, proved deeply unpopular with fans, who felt the character deserved a better goodbye than a voicemail. Ramirez played Callie Torres for 10 seasons, becoming one of the most prominent LGBTQ+ characters in network television history along the way. When the news of their exit broke in 2016, Shonda Rhimes herself said she'd only learned about it a few days before the public did. Ramirez later explained they'd hit an emotional wall after a decade in the role and needed space to breathe. The show had luckily already filmed footage of Callie relocating to New York for a fellowship, which softened what could have been an even more jarring exit. Ramirez has never ruled out a return, but hasn't gone back to the franchise since leaving. After 12 seasons playing Dr. Jackson Avery, Williams exited in 2021 on his own terms, telling reporters at the time that his next move needed to genuinely scare him rather than simply extend a role he already knew well. His final storyline sent Jackson to Boston to lead his family's medical foundation and pursue racial justice work in healthcare, a plot that deliberately mirrored Williams' own activism outside the show. He called filming his goodbye scenes cathartic, and the gamble of stepping away from a hit series paid off. Williams moved to Broadway and earned a Tony nomination for his work in Take Me Out not long after leaving Grey Sloan behind. In 2022, after 19 seasons as Meredith Grey, Pompeo scaled back to a handful of episodes a year while remaining an executive producer and narrator. She's compared the move to sending a kid off to college, joking that 19 years was longer than most parents keep their children at home, that her brain had started to feel like scrambled eggs from doing the same job for 2 decades, and that it was simply time to do something new with her career. But in later interviews, she's been more direct about the financial calculus behind staying attached to the show in some capacity. If she walked away completely, the show would keep generating revenue from a character she originated, while she'd stop benefiting from it at all. In 2017, she'd already negotiated a deal reportedly worth around $20 million, making her the highest-paid actress on television at the time, a milestone she said took years of pushing back against a pay gap with her male co-stars to achieve.